Hello, welcome back everybody. I hope you had a good tea break and you are ready for this next session. I'm very excited to invite Patrick Johnstone up onto the stage. He's a very accomplished author and has inspired many a Christian work. And we want to give him all the time he needs. So if you just join me in a quick prayer for Patrick, just for God to really speak through him. And we'll get started. So let's just pray. God, I just want to pray for Patrick right now, Lord God, that you're using God to send your message, Lord God, that you're using to speak to your people, Lord God, for hearts to be changed, Lord God, and for decisions to be made, Lord God, as a result of these words, Lord Jesus. In your holy name we pray. Amen.
Well, thank you all for coming along. I hope what I share with you is not too depressing, but invigorating to help you have a vision for a very difficult future we face in our world. And so I've got here basically what I want to cover during this time. And so firstly I just want to speak about the perfect storm, all the different things that are converging, coming to us, that are making life difficult in a very changing world. And then we'll look again at the whole challenge of refugees for the future. And what are we likely to have to handle in the future? And I think what will come out is we've got an even bigger challenge with refugees than we have up until now. And then, thirdly, how do we prepare for the future? I will just say a few words on that. And then I want us all to break up into one of three kinds of groups. And it doesn't matter which one you go to, whether you fit into that group or not. For instance, one of the groups that I'd like to have is those who are involved in church work. How do we prepare our churches for the future and the ministry that is going to be right for the future? And secondly, another group for those who are involved in various agencies, ministries that are aiming at refugees. And I want to give you another set of questions which I have up, and you can deal with one or two of each of those questions and come back with an answer in our closing moments. And the last one is that basically I see we working as a unified team from all over the world to reach the people who come to these shores and also to evangelize the local people. For instance, I have a lot of contact with Nigerian Christians. One of the things that impresses me is that many of those Nigerian Christians are very free to witness to English-speaking people. And often they are given more opportunity by the English because they're foreign and so they don't understand our customs, you don't speak about religion type of thing. And so often Nigerians can go further with local people than local people with local people. So anyway, migrant communities are needed to be part of the team to welcome those who come to our shores. So that's where we will head to. Now just to give you a little bit of background, of course, they were saying something about me being a writer. I worked for 16 years in Africa, and I was largely in southern Africa. All my children were born in Africa, and during our time there in Africa, I was trying to help African Christians pray for the different countries of the world. So I started to write a book to help Africans to pray for the world. Incidentally, Africa will be the great missionary sending country in 30 years' time. Many people don't realize that, but that's happening. But my first-year wife, Jill, she wrote a book like that for children called You Can Change the World. Our prayers change our world. And so, underlying everything I say is this fact of prayer being so important if we're going to see the gospel entering the hearts of those who come to our shores. And I wrote this book, I've now handed it over to others, they carry on. And that book has gone into many languages. And I've also written a book about migrants. There you can see it. And I've got a few copies here if anybody wants one. But most of the people that we are interested in live in this kind of area. And you will see again and again coming up in the different challenges we face that this coloured area of the world is going to be the key for the future. Firstly, most of the people who do not know Jesus live in those countries coloured yellow or brown. And we therefore need to be ready to do something that is going to impact those countries. I spoke at a conference some years ago, about 6 years ago, in Hungary. It was organised by the Refugee Highway, it's called, and it's a network of mission agencies and churches that wants to help refugees. And the conference they held had a title, and it was After the Flood. And if you remember what happened after Noah's flood, there was a rainbow. God promised he'd never make that flood happen again. But the title of that conference was After the Flood of Syrian Refugees. You may remember at that time there was civil war in Syria, and so many people left the country. There you can see the figures of a few years ago. You can see where the Syrians came from and where they went to. And so basically the conference was thinking about, after all these Syrians have come, what do we do? And I said to them, there is not a rainbow after the flood of the Syrians. It is just the beginning of a much bigger flood of refugees that will come. And that was really, in a sense, prophetic, unfortunately, because that is exactly what has happened. Look, for instance, now at the challenge we have in this country. These are the figures using the 2011 census. I haven't made use of the one census we had just last year. But there you can see indigenous European, and you can see the other ethnic groups mentioned, and how quickly that is growing. There you can see the main ones, the main contributors to the ethnic minorities. And so, what is this perfect storm? Let's move on to that first subject I want to deal with. What is the perfect storm that I'm speaking about? The first thing I just mentioned is that it's coming with the end of Western dominance. The first great impact of Western dominance were the empires that Portugal, Spain, Britain, Netherlands made of much of the world. They were trading empires. They wanted to use the raw materials of other parts of the world for what later became manufacturing in the home countries. It wasn't a very healthy situation, but it did allow also for the gospel to spread. But then after World War II came a time of globalization. And let's look at the, well, I'll come to that in a minute. We came to the globalization, the globalization that happened after World War II, when basically the United Nations came into being, and the United Nations kept a degree of peace, even in spite of the Cold War. It never fully developed into a big war, but it allowed trade to increase all over the world. And we had this globalization that's impacted us all, and it's lifted the cost of the standard of living in many countries around the world. But all that is coming to an end. And I just want to take you back in history. Now, this may be a bit complicated, but this is a picture of history since the time of Jesus. And here you can see all through history who were the major superpowers of the world. You can see at the time of Jesus on the left-hand side. It was Rome. Jesus was living in the Roman Empire. Judea was a colony of Rome, or province of the Roman Empire. There were also the Persians. They were a mighty superpower of that time. And then China. They were the three great powers. And the trade route between them was vital, then as it is now. But as we go through history, we see about 600 years later, you see greed. I'm not going to all the reasons, but just to mention, that is when Islam came. And for 1,500 years, the superpower of the world was Muslim. And that gives you some kind of idea why many Muslims feel the West has cheated them of what they were promised, that Islam would conquer the world. That underlies all the jihadism that so affected many of our countries. And you can see there that cross-hatched yellow and blue, representing Protestants and Roman Catholic mainly. It is the West. The West dominated the world for a time, but that is coming to an end. And so to put it in more clear terms, that old world order was firstly Pax Britannica, the peace that the British tried to impose on the world in the 1800s. You might remember that Britain and France had a war. And Britain won the naval battle, and ultimately the land battle, but it meant that for 150 years, the chief naval power was British. And they managed to stop the trade in slaves. Some bad things were done, some things were good. But basically, out of all this growth came the Industrial Revolution and the control of the oceans. So it allowed trade across the world in the empire time. But then after World War II, as I said earlier, the Pax Americana, the American peace, they wanted trade to be free all over the world. And it led to many countries developing their own industries. But now, that globalization is coming to an end. It's not working. And we see a second thing that has really impacted us, COVID. We all know very much about the lockdowns we went through, but COVID happened to speed up so many of the changes that would have otherwise taken maybe 20 years, 30 years to come about. And it forced all sorts of changes that were developing. Take an example, working from home. We have the means with electronics to have a hybrid life of working at home and working in the office in those kind of jobs that work like that. And so this forced everyone to work in a different kind of way than before. And it radically changes how cities operate. As a result, the railways are going to have to change. The buses are going to have to change. Restaurants are going to have to change, all because COVID pushed for these changes. And it's been devastating for the world because many governments paid huge sums of money to carry us through the difficult times of lockdown. But somehow we've got to pay those debts. We were postponing the cost by borrowing more money, and that is one of the crises our governments are having to face today. And that is going to radically change how we give in churches, how we support agencies in ministry. So the COVID pandemic has changed so much. In fact, I've listed a whole lot of things that are ending as a result of COVID. Western dominance, cheap travel, privacy. Now, everybody knows that anything that goes online will sooner or later be hacked by someone. We can't trust anything that goes by email anymore. Privacy is going to be lost. And with these cameras that the Chinese have so developed, so that in China they now watch everyone. They will even begin to now know what they are thinking by looking at their faces on cameras. And so we live in a very difficult world where privacy no longer is possible. Then declines are happening in these. Globalization, freedoms, even democracy is in decline. We see dictators popping up all over the place. And we see financial giving is declining. And then these things are changing. I've already mentioned some of them. Ecology, social, industries, work styles, missions, everything is going to now have to be recalibrated. And that's why we're in such a crisis, because nobody quite knows how to operate. And then we have this tragedy that happened for the world with the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Because when we look at the situation there, what comes from Russia and Ukraine is cooking oil, wheat, corn, barley, fertilizer, all the things that the world needs to grow crops. And this invasion has dealt with a large minority of the sources of these vital things. And many of their exports go to Africa, the Middle East, and to an extent in Asia. And so the whole world is being forced into a famine situation. I saw reports given, for instance, that possibly in the next 18 months, if the prices go on increasing as they were, if things don't change, between 250 million and 1 billion people will die of starvation in the next 18 months, 2 years. That's horrendous. I don't think it will be as bad as that. I won't go into it now, but basically, the world is going to go into a famine. And think of all the refugees that will come because they've got nothing to eat or drink. And so we face a crisis because of that war. But then, it's not only the war between Russia and Ukraine. There is another war that has been going on since the middle of the 1980s. And that's the war of the jihadists against the corrupt rulers of the Middle East, against the West especially. The jihadists want to return to the old vision of Islam to conquer the world. And so we see this. But here is the Muslim world in a way that may be strange to you. Here you can see the countries, not how big they are, but the populations. So the Muslim population of each country makes the country bigger. That's why the map looks a bit distorted. But basically, one of the things I want to point out to you is that in the middle is the dark green of Shia Islam. The lighter green is Sunni Islam, and they hate each other. And somehow all this is fed into the jihadist theme, and we find that if we look at where violence is likely to happen, every red dot indicates war over the next 30 years. Every yellow dot indicates unrest. Now this I did about 10 years ago. I was not strong enough in what I put down. And so basically what we're going to see is not only the war between Ukraine and Russia, but also within the Muslim world is going to be strife. And so what is going to happen? Many people are going to be disillusioned with Islam, and millions are going to flee from the countries where Islam is fighting. Because bear in mind that almost all the people who are killed in jihadist attacks are Muslims already. And so here you can see we face a time of conflict. And then we have another thing that I've also alluded to, but I will just bring it up again. The debt crisis. Those of us who read the newspapers and see the news in Britain, we know about the huge debt we built up over the time of COVID, And now we're having to give money, and many European countries and America giving money to the Ukrainians to help them defend themselves. And the overall cost of these wars and of COVID is putting us all into huge debt. And that has to be paid. And so it's going to be a difficult time ahead. Then we have another thing that contributes to the perfect storm. It's climate change. We're seeing it more and more. And look at the countries that produce the most carbon dioxide. And here they are. The darker the red, the greater the production of the gases that heat up the world. It's not only carbon dioxide that's a problem, many other things. But this is one of the key tests. Notice how little Africa produces to increase the CO2 emissions. Yet it is Africa that is going to pay the greatest price. Here you can see the areas of the world that are going to likely be most affected by climate change. I think there's one thing in error there. I think the Arctic and Antarctic are going to suffer more than is indicated on this map. But look at the red areas, North India, Pakistan, the Sahel in Africa. And so we're going to see huge impact on these countries through global climate change. These are countries that are going to produce millions of refugees. Where are they going to go? And for instance, in the Sahel, there is warfare going right across the Sahel at the moment. And the last conference I spoke at overseas was at a conference in Burkina Faso, there in the middle of West Africa. And there all the churches and agencies got together for a conference. How do we deal with the situation where our people are having to flee from their homes and churches being burnt and jihadists killing our people? And it's basically Islam using the conflict between the herders and the agriculturalists. This is why Darfur in Sudan is in such problem today. It's the herders against the agriculturalists. And so we find that climate change is deeply affecting the world. Another point in climate change is the rivers of the world. We're seeing this increasingly now. How many countries with shared river systems are in crisis? The darker the red, the bigger the problem. Think of the problems of Iraq today, with Turkey damming the rivers that flow into Iraq and Syria and to an extent in Iran. And the water is getting less, and the people are suffering from lack of water. Their fields are dying. Pakistan, one river is the main source of their water, the Indus, and they share it with India. And one country living off one river, if the monsoon fails, what will they do? We may have millions of Pakistanis looking for refuge when their country dries up. And then we have another thing that is happening that contributes. And that is something that may seem rather strange to you, is population collapse. But basically, what we're seeing is that many countries today, their birth rate is going down and down. China made a terrible mistake in counting their population. They only discovered a few months ago that they've lost 100 million people. They overestimated. The officials submitted higher figures for birth rates so that they got more money from the government, and they didn't realize they were being cheated. And so suddenly China finds they've got 100 million people less, and then they find they've got even less women. So there are fewer people to have children, and already the population is going down. In 2050, I think 70% of the population of China will be nearing retirement or at retirement. How are they going to support their old people? We have the same sort of situation in Europe. And so population collapse is becoming a real issue. Let me show it to you in the diagram. This is a composite, what we call an age pyramid. The old people are at the top and the babies at the bottom. And you can see in Africa, Asia, Latin America, that's AFASA, and Europe, North America, Pacific are the green. And you can see how the bulge has happened in the West, or UNAPA, and the number of babies born gets less and less every year. But in AFASA, that went on growing until recently, and now it's slowing down. So in about 2070, the world population will decline from then onwards. But many countries will start before then. And there's a population deficit. That's the blue. And what is going to happen? That vacuum, that emptiness, is going to be filled by people coming from these areas. So whether we try to or not, the refugee problem will continue. But the point I want to bring out is what was brought out by Nadim in his message. The world is coming to us. What we're going to find is that whatever walls we put up, whatever navies we put to sea, whatever arrangements we make in other countries, people are going to come. And so we must prepare for the ministry opportunities this is giving. Because many parts of the world are not yet adequately covered by the gospel. And that map I showed you at the beginning shows the countries that are least evangelized. But let me give you some encouragement. We've been living through a remarkable time. And basically in the 1960s, God was working in power in Africa. Many countries saw millions become Christian. In the 1970s, it was Latin America. The 1980s, it was East Asia, China and Indonesia. The 1990s, it was the former communist bloc. Many of the Central Asian countries opened up for the gospel. But in the recent years, it's been the Muslim world that's begun to respond. And this here shows BMBs, that means believers from a Muslim background. Okay? So these are former Muslims and their children who became Christian. And you can see in 1960, we tried to do a survey, and we reckon that in 1960 there were only about 60,000 people all over the world who'd once been Muslim and become Christian. 60,000, less than an ordinary city in Europe. But then we find, as time went on, terrible things happened in parts of the Muslim world. There was a failed coup in Indonesia, and 6 million people turned from Islam to Jesus. Then came the Iranian Revolution and the Ayatollahs. And some people say the greatest evangelist for Iran has been the Ayatollah Khomeini, because he made many Iranians not like what they saw of Islam. And so we find that today there's been this amazing number of Iranians who've become believers in Jesus. Then we have Al-Qaeda coming. They declared war on the West and the Gulf states. Then Algeria's civil war. And in the middle of that civil war, a great turning to God took place amongst the indigenous population, the Kabyle. Then 9/11, and then we find many people in other parts of the Muslim world beginning to realize that Islam had a violence to it that made them want to look for something different. If you take away the population of Indonesian Christians who were once Muslim, we get that purple line. So you can see from the time that the jihadists started, the turning to God began in other parts of the Muslim world. So it's not all discouraging. God is giving us opportunities, and people are far more willing to hear, especially when they've been uprooted and forced to move from their country. They've got trauma, they've got pain, and they don't know where to find answers. We've got a wonderful opportunity to witness to them and share the love of Jesus. The Great Commission that Jesus gave us is still just as valid. And so here this is the last command Jesus ever gave. The beginning of Acts, we find it. And after the Holy Spirit has come upon you, you shall be my witnesses in Jerusalem, all Judea, Samaria, and the ends of the earth. And these we can tie in with cities. Jerusalem was a city. Judea were countries. Samaria, they were the refugees of many years before, living in the middle of the Jews, and they hated them. So in a sense, they stand for the peoples or refugees in the world. And then we have the ends of the earth. And I just want to emphasize religions. So just very, very briefly, this is the challenge we have. I've given you the negative, but now this is the challenge Jesus gives us. And we want to fit that challenge in to the crisis of the world that it's going through now. So here's I'll just show you this too. This amazing turning to God. Here is where we see evangelical Christians. The yellow is evangelical Christians, and there you can see the figure for 1900. And you can see the red areas. Basically, the gospel was confined to the Western countries. But look at the change by 1960. Look at the shades changing. We look by 2000, how Africa, Latin America has got many born-again people now. China, and so on. So we still see areas of need, but basically God has worked wonderfully in the last 120 years. And so I'll leave that. But then showing the evangelical growth. Where has been this growth of evangelicals the most? Remember, our FASA is Africa, Asia, Latin America, Europe, North America, Pacific. In other words, the long Christian lands are down on the brown line, and the newer Christian lands are in the red line. And you can see the amazing growth of the number of people who are born again in other parts of the world. So the center of gravity has moved from the west to the non-west. I don't like the term, that's why I prefer aphasia. And can I just add that many in more recent years are Muslim. I failed to give you the figure. I told you 60,000 believers from a Muslim background in 1960. By 2010, we reckoned that it reached 20 million. Some reckon that that's gone up higher today, and it has. I can't give you a figure, but it's a very approximate. And here you see the peak of the growth. Every 10 years, you can see the addition of evangelicals, which is the yellow, Pentecostals, who are also evangelical, but this is the Pentecostal component, and then the charismatics we find here. And so we see this amazing peak around 2000, 2010 of this great tide of people into the kingdom of God. It slowed since then, partly because of what I told you earlier. There are fewer children to win to Jesus. And it's mostly children and young people who come to Jesus. And now it's much harder to evangelize adults. But then we have the cities, that I was mentioning earlier. Notice that our century is unique. In 2007, if the United Nations figures are correct, and they're pretty good, in 2007, the number of people living in cities became more than those who live in country areas. In the past, we've thought of mission work as in the jungles, in the deserts, in the forests, and whatever. But the 21st century is urban. And more people are going to live in cities. So we've got to think in terms of mission work in cities. And there's only one ministry that really is effective, and that is disciple making. You can't start hospitals, you can't do all sorts of other things that missionaries did in past years. The only effective way is to actually lead people to Jesus and help them to become leaders in the church. So this is the kind of ministry that awaits us. Look at the way cities have grown. These are the cities in 2000. There was just one red blob of a meta city, as the United Nations calls it. That means 20 million more or more living in that city. That's 2000. This is 2025, just in 3 years' time. Look at the red blobs getting bigger, and look at cities in 2050. In just 26 years' time, the world will be urbanized. And that is why cities are so important. And many of them will be slums. I served God for 16 years in the slums of Southern Africa. That's where God called us. It was tough, but we had this remarkable thing of seeing people being discipled for Jesus. Look where the biggest cities in the world are. In 2000, the top city was Tokyo in China, Japan. In 2025, it will be Mumbai in India. And in 2050, it will be Lagos in Nigeria. Probably 63 million people living in one city. Can you imagine it? And the majority living in slums. And so we're going to have many people coming from cities because life is so desperate. They want to find somewhere where they can have a better living for their children. And that is why all these things contribute to the task we have. Then we have countries. I won't say much on that, but I will just point out. There are 244 nations in the world, or nations and territories. 155 of them would have a majority calling themselves Christian. Then we have another 25 where there's been a great breakthrough, like Korea, Singapore, Chad. But then we have pioneer lands, where there are not enough workers. And most of them are in those areas that I showed you that are in most need. And these are the areas that are going to produce the most refugees. So basically what is happening, the majority of refugees are coming from the countries that have had the least of the gospel. There's another time there, I won't go into that. But basically, what we're seeing is that God is bringing to us the people who come from the areas that are the least evangelized. And then we have the peoples, like the Samaritans. And the whole world can be divided out amongst the peoples of the world. There are about, this is the countries, I've got the order wrong. These are the countries, these are the countries of the world that are the least evangelized. And there you can see the green of Islam. Most of the countries that are least evangelized are Muslim. And you can see the countries there with red and orange, or green, who are providing the most refugees or migrants. And so these are countries that really need the gospel. I leave this one. But then when we look at the peoples of the world, if we take out, in that list of the Joshua Project, if you want to find out about the peoples of the world, go to the internet and look up Joshua Project. And you'll find information on every language and people in the world. Joshua Project. But these are the figures from that list, taking out the castes of India. The castes of India have separate entries in that list to make it up to 16,000. And I take them out and a few others that are very small, and we end up with about 12,000 peoples in the world, in the countries of the world. How many of them are Christian? Well, about half. How many have had a mission breakthrough? About a quarter. Very close. But these represent here the unfinished task. There are about 3,000 peoples in the world where there are very few Christians. And many of these are becoming international. They're moving. And so that is why the task is so great. I could show you that, my time is going. Finally, the religion. We've got a huge challenge with the major religious systems. This is the situation in 1887. This was published in a book at that time. We have Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic, Muslim. Every square stands for 1 million people. The population of the world then was about the same size as that of India today. But notice, after 100 years, after William Carey, one of the first early missionaries, went to India, After 100 years, there were about 3 million who come to Jesus out of the non-Christian world. That's all. It's in the 20th century that the great breakthrough has come. But then when we look at the map of the main religions of the world, these present us a huge challenge. The Muslim world, green; the Hindu world, red; and the Buddhist world, yellow. And so we must face that challenge. Now I just want to move briefly on to the second point, is where do these refugees come from, and where will they come from? Here are the figures from the United Nations. This shows the number of refugees that they have counted inside and outside the countries where refugees come. The 120 is 120 million. So for about 20 years, the number of refugees stayed about the same, with constant movement of refugees and then being absorbed in the countries to which they had gone. But since 2011, that figure has gone up dramatically. So it's moved up from 40 million in 2011 or 2012 to over 100 million today. And that is going to go on up for the reasons that I've given. And where did the migrant waves come from in the past? We know in the Britain, the South Asians, Caribbeans, Ugandan nations, Arabs, Somalis, West Africans, Eritreans, Iraqis, Afghans, and now more recently Hong Kong, and now very recently Ukraine. And these are the refugees, the top 10 refugees in the countries producing refugees. And there you can see in this. We won't go through it all. But I've given in the last column the cause of them becoming refugees. You see, the top of the list of 10, the lowest number, but for a little country, Eritrea has produced nearly 500,000 refugees. Central African Republic, Somalia, Sudan, we have the Sudanese here, and that includes both south and north. Then we have the Congo, but most of them are within the Congo. But the suffering in Congo is awful, and we hardly hear anything about it. We have the Rohingya Muslims who fled to Bangladesh and are treated terribly there, and even worse in their homeland of Myanmar. There's South Sudan. Oh, sorry, this is separate. And then Afghanistan, Ukraine, and Syria. It was Ukraine and Syria provided the most refugees in recent years. But think of the people who cross Africa. They cross the Sahara Desert. They have gang masters, criminal gangs that help them get across, pay lots of money for it, and here they've ended up in a prison in Libya. And they become sex slaves, they become like slaves, and the sufferings they've gone through. They don't leave their homes because they just like a more comfortable life. They've left something pretty bad back home. And then we think of the suffering of Christians. I won't go into that now. That is also causing many to flee. Actually, I will show it. And here are Christians in Burkina Faso, burying some of their Christians who've been killed by the jihadists. There are Egyptians who are guest workers in Libya. They were told, you have to accept Islam or we shoot you. They said, shoot us. And every one of them was shot there. But many have fled because of the persecution. I hate it when people speak about illegal immigration. How can somebody come to our country and be called illegal when they are running away to save their lives? The illegality is really the system that didn't allow them to have a check-in in some way or another. But anyway, there we see illegal or enforced migration in 2009. This is just an illustration. These are figures. It shows people crossing the Mediterranean. And there's the Americans trying to build a wall to stop people coming over the border into the States. Whatever we do, as I said earlier, in trying to stop people coming, we're going to fail. Look at the problems our government is having now. They've got that place in Kent full of people, and they don't know what to do with it. And we've got to retool ourselves to work out how we handle a situation that is going to go on. It's not going to go away because we pass a law. And these are the refugee routes that some of you might have used. But there you can see those refugee routes coming to countries that are likely to give them safety and freedom. Future migrant waves, where are they going to come from? The China Initiative to help countries be part of their road and the Silk Road type of thing, I lost the name for a minute, what they call it, this trade route across the world. And they are funding countries that bring them into huge debt, and then they demand their money back when the time is up. And Sri Lankans are suffering. Pakistan is suffering today because of this Belt and Road, actually the Belt and Road initiative. And it's really a means of getting people hooked into China for their ends, not for the countries that they are giving money to. And sadly, many of them are corrupt, and how much of the money goes into the projects for which it was given. But anyway, there you can see the future migrant waves, where they're going to come from. The Yemenis, there's a terrible civil war going on in Yemen. We've hardly seen anything about it yet, but it's there. And half the country is facing starvation at the moment because of the long civil war. Somalis again, the Sahelians, I showed that. Eritreans and Ethiopians have got a war on at the moment in Tigray, in the north. And the Sudanese, the mess in that country, those two countries, is terrible. And then we're going to find, again, Pakistan is coming. Look at the floods they've had recently, destroying all their crops. They won't get anything to eat next year. And the Chinese trying to flee oppression with what's going on in China today. There are going to be many surprises. I don't know what they will be, but that is the kind of situation we face. And so we've got to prepare for a future. And this is where I'm going to pass over to you. And what I'd like to do is to underline the fact that we in Europe are a mission field. Here you can see the population of Britain, or Europe, in 2000. Look at that offset bit on the vertical bar. That offset bit represents migrant origin people. They may be third, fourth generation, but they may have a brown skin or a dark skin or whatever. But there you can see those of migrant origin and the indigenous. Look how the population of the indigenous is going down by 2050. And the migrant origin is going up. But it still doesn't equal the population it once was. We need those people for our countries to run. And so it's ridiculous to say that people coming in are going to steal our jobs. It doesn't work like that. We've got a crisis on the lack of labour. And yet we say we don't want immigrants. It's a strange business. But anyway, there you can see it. But look at the different religions amongst the migrant population. Look how many Christians there are. We need to work together as Christians in multicultural teams to win the world. And so we need churches that represent the populations we live amongst. And of course, this is one of the big reasons for this conference. And so what I want you to do now is to go into 3 different groups. I'll get some hands put up in a minute. But I want some to make a little church group, or maybe several. One for those who come from a migrant origin, to talk about how you can contribute, or you can, if you're dealing with agencies, to make another. But you can go to any group. You're not limited because of your origin, but you can choose. But basically, these are the questions that I'd like to put to you. For churches, you may want to pick up 1 or 2 of these only. I'm just giving you some ideas. You don't even have to use the ideas. How do we change the attitude of churches towards foreigners? How do we help churches to adapt to the multiculturalism, or are multicultural to adapt to the local church? How to welcome strangers? How do we integrate a church so that we have diversity? There's a huge difference between a multicultural church and an intercultural church. An intercultural church is like the church in Antioch. They had leadership, and every part of the church was multicultural. Multicultural, but it was an intercultural church. A multicultural church keeps all the sections separate, and they never seem to mix properly. They all sit together in one place. How do we have an intercultural church so that everyone feels on equal communicating terms with everybody else in the congregation? And then how do we develop leadership that is multicultural, like the church in Antioch? And how do we support ministries when our church doesn't have many people of varying origins? Then agencies, there's a list of questions. I leave it up. How do we envision the future? How do we have to adapt our work methods? What financial models can we use to survive when giving goes down radically? How do we research the needs and make it public? How do we make personnel and resources available for churches and others to use, even government agencies? And then the migrant communities, just think that you could think through what could have been done better for you to be received well in a local church. We might learn some important lessons there. How do we help people to adapt to the authorities, which is a terrible problem in our home office? How can it be done better by those welcoming? How can churches do things better? How do we integrate into society and churches as migrants? And teamwork in outreach that I was mentioning earlier, we need that. And welcoming other refugees. Do you realize if you are from a migrant community, you will often have far more credibility and entrance into the lives of others because of what you've gone through. And you need to have your eyes open, not to keep your own culture to survive, but to have others to adapt. And could I just say, if you start a group for your culture, to keep your culture alive, that's not wrong, but it will only last half a generation. In 15 years, 20 years, it will be dead. Because your children won't want to keep to the old culture. They will adapt to you. And so you need to think more carefully how you integrate into the future. Well, there we go. Could I ask, how many of you here would prefer to be in a group that does the church's question? Can you put up your hand? Okay. Could I suggest you come over to this table over here? Okay? And then how many of you here would prefer to go to an agency? Okay, could I suggest that you go to this table here? And how many of you would like to go to a migrant? Okay, all the migrant people, if you could go over to those tables over there, and then I will call you back in a quarter of an hour, and if you can have one point to share from your discussion, or maybe two. Can you give me a good right? Folks, you might want to go on speaking about this a lot longer, but I think we must draw the meeting to a conclusion. But what I'd like you to do now, could each table give us one key thing that came out that you felt was important to share with others? If you can do that, it doesn't have to be all those questions, it might be something different. But it is a diamond of information that will bless us all. Could I ask if you, have you got something that you would like? If you're not ready for it, just talk again about what thing you'd like to mention. Okay? Give you another minute. Are you ready? Okay, we'll give them another 15 seconds here. Oh yes, good idea. Could you be the taker of the mic delivery? Okay, he's our mic deliverer. Okay, so that table over there is going to share. And what is your special item that you'd like to mention?
Basically, the real sensation that linked an awful lot of the discussion we had was that migrant communities have something really important to share with everybody, with other migrant communities, with the people that are receiving migrants, and basically migrant communities have something worthwhile to share.
Yes, and could I add to that? That is a brilliant thing that you said. But the other thing is, if you only have a group that keeps African custom, you know, it doesn't matter if you come an hour late, or the preaching goes on for 3 hours, you won't win other people.
That's right, yeah. I just wanted to add also that we, you know, as communities, so we can welcome people, tell them, you know, where to go when they have questions. Basically also, you know, helping them to find where they can be helped. So basically, you know, this integration is a two-way process in which, you know, the community, you know, is encouraged to open the space for migrants, but also the migrant has to be active and willing to, you know, to be helped.
Yes, good. Thank you very much. Who else would we like to be next? Okay, here to this table, brother.
So we were representing agencies, and I guess one key thing was, we talked about a lot, but one key thing was how agencies and churches need to work together better in the UK, and that's various different aspects, but, you know, bringing vision together. And I guess the second thing was the financial models. Agencies need to consider changing financial models for people from other backgrounds working in the UK or wherever. Currently the models that agencies have don't really work for funding refugees.
Could I just add something from my experience, is that it often takes patience and time for a church to change. And we have to model to the church a Christian attitude in the process. Okay, anybody else? Who's the name? Over here, brother.
We did talk about adapting church life and things like we've done today with songs, but we also felt the Welcome Box scheme has been a very good way of engaging with refugees, and that whether we could take that a step further by setting up, I suppose, a resource hub with advice for refugees in our communities and in our churches, very much like the debt advice that churches took on in the 90s and early 2000s for people who were struggling with money. So,
Thank you, that's beautiful. Okay, anybody else want to add something to those words? Okay, over to you.
Just adding whatever they have been saying, mostly it's about welcoming communities and mostly about the trauma and well-being. Having those people who are chosen in the church like ushers, because if you get a problem, you can't go and pick one person. So there are people who have been chosen in any churches that if you're having a problem, you can contact that person and talk to them and to be strong.
Excellent. You're so right. I think that it's very hard for people locally to understand the trauma and the multiple trials that people have gone through. For instance, even with housing, put in one place, then they have to move, then they have to move. They've already done that dozens of times in getting here. And the orphans of not having your own things around you and being moved. How do you help people? And could I make a suggestion to all those who've gone through this experience? Do share your experiences, where things went right and where things went wrong, so that people can learn. Okay? Right. Anybody who else is? Yes, here, this table over here. Our last one. And then I think it's going to be meal time.
Yeah, we were dealing with agencies as well, so we just talked about how the need to have a clear vision of moving forward, whether that was like a university trying to teach English or English organisations or materials, and just the need for research to actually see what is really happening so that we can make resources available, personnel available, so the emphasis on research is so necessary to us. And because of financial, everything's affected. Research will be really important.
Thank you. I will add something to there too. The census results of the 2021 UK census, or the Scottish one is failed, sorry to say, but the English and Welsh one is good, and that gives the ethnicity and religion of every postal district in your city. And if you can get hold of that information, you have a mine of information where the people are that you may be praying. Okay? Well, thank you all for this time. Shall we just close with prayer and just ask the Lord to embed in our hearts that which we've learned today and will be learning over this time. Shall we pray? Our loving Father, we just want to commit every moment that we've experienced so far, the new friendships made, the experiences shared, the things learnt. We pray, help us to grow in as ministry, your ministers in this world. And I pray, dear Lord, that even as a result of today, there will be dynamic things that are going to happen in individual lives, in churches, in agencies, and in our country. So we commit this all to you, in Jesus' name. Amen.
Thank you.